Hi everyone, Angus Campbell here. It's the weekend again, and that can mean only one thing. Back on the A70 Lightning, and this time obviously it's the rear wheel turn. Rear wheel brake, brake plate, bearings, and fitting the rear wheel hopefully into the swinging arm. So we'll just get set up here and I'll go through where we start and how we're going to crack on. Okay, so here we've got then all the rear brake, brake plate and sprocket parts, and also the rear wheel spindle, bearings and bearing tubes, etc., ready to assemble. They've all been cleaned up, and everything's cleaned up really well, to be honest. The brake shoes again are hardly worn, and they've cleaned up really well. They're the original riveted ones. There's tons of meat on them, so they're fantastic. The sprocket almost looks like new. It's definitely the original. The teeth are in very good order, and if you look back at the previous video with the parts, this was black with muck, and it's cleaned up beautifully, and you can tell from the pattern on the securing bolt holes which way round this was mounted, and this is even marked up with you can't see it, I don't think, but it's stamped 52, i.e. 52 teeth. It's a little pot marked on the that's the inner edge, but the plating is in good nick, so that's fine. On the outer surface it's in very good condition, one or two little abrasions, but again the plating is good and shiny. I've not shined this up at all, I've just cleaned it in gunk, and that's fantastic. I've managed to clean up the original sprocket mounting bolt nuts and washers. The bolts themselves weren't very good at all, but I've got a new set in stock, so we'll use the new set. The rear wheel spindle, the original one, didn't have a nutter or a washer on it when I stripped the bike, but I've got one from stock, which is new old stock, and that's only got very slight patina on it, so it's polished up and it's got good plating on it, and similarly it's got the proper original nut and shouldered nut and shouldered washer, which I think is correct, rather than just any straightforward flat nut. Other thing to mention is, I'm checking the rear wheel bearings. Both of them have play in them. They've had it, so they're scrap. So we'll be replacing those with some new ones I've got from stock. The Speedo drive is the original again. Still got the remnants of the original sticker on it. I've just taken off the grease nipple, because this is okay. It wasn't dry. It still works. It needs packing with grease, but it does need spraying up. So we'll give that a quick spray before we put the wheel into the bike. And I think that's about it to mention. Oh yes, one other thing is that with respect to the rear brake spindle arm, this is the spindle, and originally this was the nut and washer, and it's the usual BSA, almost sort of half height nut, and it's a locking nut, which is right. These are quite difficult to get hold of, and if you compare that half height locking nut to a full height, you might find this difficult to see actually. The difference in the height means that when you screw onto the available thread on the spindle, a full height locking nut doesn't actually secure itself, because there's not enough thread to go through the nylock locking material on the end of the nut on these modern nuts. So I've chosen to go with a more traditional non-nylock nut, but with a spring washer. And although that's not quite right, I'll feel more comfortable with that, rather than relying on a full height nylock, as the original nut isn't in very good shape actually, and I've not been able to clean it up, and it doesn't look in very good condition, so we're not going to use it. So that was that. Right, I'm going to turn you around and we'll have a quick look at the bike as is before we then start to assemble the rear brake. So here's the bike as it stands at the moment. You remember the last significant video was installing the front wheel. We've got one minor job left to do on that, and that is actually showing you how to adjust the front brake shoes. But we'll do that towards the end of this if I remember. But as you can see, I've loosely fitted in the rear wheel just on a spindle just to get the look. And initially, just looking at it, the wheel diameter just looked a little small to me. So I've checked in, it is 18 inch, and that is correct. 19 inch front, 18 inch rear. But once we get all the brake paraphernalia on there and also the sprocket, it'll totally change the look of that. Also, you've got the rear chain guard as well to go on there, so that rear end will change. You'll notice as well that I've just loosely fitted the rear grab handle, and actually that fits absolutely perfectly, and the holes line up at the back perfectly as well. I've not mounted it up properly yet. We'll do that shortly, but let's focus on the wheel tonight. So I'll get this wheel out, and then we'll go back to the bench. We'll get the rear brake made up onto the plate, and then we'll install new bearings and the bearing spacer into the rear wheel with the usual grease retaining caps, and also the screw-in, what are they called? The screw-in bearing retainers, that's what they are. Okay. Okay, right, first things first. First thing will be the grease nipple that goes onto the shroud for the spindle on the top side. I'll grease up the spindle before it goes in. Okay, that's that done. There's the rear brake torque arm is mounted on that stud there with a plain nut, which is the original in this case, which did clean it well, but then a spring washer, new spring washer, because the original was missing. We'll just put that on there for now, ready to mount to the torque arm once the wheel's in, and then we can turn over. And the first things first is to insert the rear brake arm spindle, actuating spindle. Now we'll just grease that up first. Don't want to lather it too much because we want it well lubricated, but we don't want it to be so packed that it ingresses into the brake. This is quite tight. I think I'm going to have to clean that out a little. I have wiped it out, but it might have a little bit of paint in there from the powder coat. So I'll just run a small file through it, and I'll bring you back. Okay, run a file through it just to dress it slightly, get rid of the excess paint, and then I tapped in the spindle with a rub mallet, and it was a little tight at first, but once it was through, it spins beautifully there, and there's absolutely no play in that whatsoever. It's really nice. Fantastic. So that's that. And then with respect to this being a single leading shoe brake, it's dead easy. We've first got to put a couple of what they call these abutments onto the end of the shoes. And these are just steel press-on plates to provide a mating face that won't wear, that actually presses against the rear brake arm spindle and cam. So that, if you like, is the end that's going to get some rotational wear potentially on it, and would wear the alley unless they had these steel sort of fascia plates on them. So it's effectively a simple case of putting these faces on both. They're fairly loose, but that doesn't matter, because ultimately they actually slot into the rear brake arm spindle cam anyway. And then we've got the job of replacing the springs. And with these springs, actually they only go in one way because they've got opposite loops on them, so that makes it easy. Back end on one shoe, front end on the other. I'm just hesitating here because that spring is not very tight at all. Let me just check the Always Handy Parts book, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Well, from the parts book, it would appear I've got these in upside down. let's have a think. So this mounts in the wheel probably like so, and in fact, yeah, I've got the shoes in the wrong way round because the leading edge is in the wrong direction, so that's incorrect. So let's take these off, which is easy enough to do. And basically turn them round. Well, I would never have thought that if I hadn't checked. There you go. That's better. That is better. So, there we are. So if we look at it like this, that's the rear brake torque arm mounting stud and nut. That's the rear brake arm itself on its spindle and cam. So that goes at the top of the wheel, and therefore, because this is on the left hand side, the wheel rotation is that way around. So therefore, the leading edge of the shoe, which is the lead in, is on the obviously leading edge of the rotation, not the trailing edge, where you get a space with the shoe, which is correct. And then the trailing edge, can't see that very well, the trailing edge of the preceding shoe goes right up to the end of the shoe, but not the leading edge, and that's correct. So good job we checked, really, because otherwise I'd have had these in the wrong way around, and that would lead to severe brake grab and wheel locking. Right, that's it. That's the brake plate ready. So what I'll do now is we'll prepare the parts next to insert the bearings into the rear wheel. So I'll just put those together now, get some new bearings out, and then we'll do the same as the front wheel, and probably have to do a bit of gentle persuasion, but this is a little more straightforward. Back shortly, and we'll try and do this on the bench. Okay, here we are on the with the rear wheel. So this is the left hand side, so rotation is that way. The recently made up brake plate fits in fine, so the brakes aren't going to bind. What we've got to do here is we've got to mount the sprocket on this side, and we'll insert the bearings. So I've got two brand new bearings, beautifully smooth. I need to pack those with grease. This is there's a spacing retainer that sits in between the bearings. So essentially the way to do this is drift a bearing in one side first, put its requisite grease retaining plates and the bearing screw-in retainer on that side, drift in the spacer from the other side, then put in the grease retainers and drift in the bearing, and then screw in the bearing retaining ring from the other side. And the bearing retaining ring on the other side of the wheel is this big ring that also drives the speedo drive. So we can attack it from either side but we'll probably, as we're this side, we'll attack it from this side first. And therefore what we need to do is, in this case, we put a grease retaining ring in first, which just sits in there, and that then actually goes up against a ledge that's just cast in to the hub. So it sits flush like so. That's good. Brand new bearing. Put plenty of grease inside the grease retainer itself, so we've got plenty in reserve. Just greasing up the bearing at the moment from both surfaces, and then winding the grease in. And I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, it's actually filled with grease around all the balls from both sides. Spun as well. That's popped in there a treat. That's fine. And then on this side we have the screw and bearing retainer ring. Right, let me play with this a little bit and I'll bring you back. Otherwise this video is going to be 3 hours long. Okay, we got it in the end. So I had to sit down and think about this again and just do a bit of testing. So basically this is the left hand side of the wheel, so the wheel will rotate that way, i.e. obviously anti-clock. So the brake drum rotates this way, so that rotation should be the same rotation as the locking ring, so that if they do rub, the locking ring tightens up. The bearing retainer ring, I should say, tightens up, so it is a right hand thread, and that's the problem we were having. So it's in now, done. Next thing, sprocket. So that's the back here. This way round. Just make sure that the holes line up before we tap it on, and it's definitely the bolts go in from this side, so we can use the bolts to locate. So it's in the right position. There we go, partly in. That one's gone through, that's fine. Final one. And then with a rubber mallet, She's in. We turn her over on the other side. I'll put a bit of a cloth underneath the brake plate. The brake plate's quite snug so it won't fall out. And we'll see that, don't know if you can see that on your side, you might not be able to see, but anyway the bolts have come through so we can put the nuts and washers on. 5. And then we'll get on to drifting in the grease retaining plate, the bearing, and the speedo drive cum bearing retainer ring on this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the nuts and washers loosely now onto the sprocket retaining bolts. As I said before, I'm using new bolts, but I'm using the original washers and the original half-height lock nuts, so I get a full knot on the bolt because they are a specific length. Right, we've got one nut missing somewhere. There it is. That's that. So next thing is the bearing spacer. Centre that into the bearing that's on the other side. That bearing won't push through because it's got its bearing retaining ring in. Let's just use something else just to drift that in. Because that bearing drifter I've got there sometimes tends to get a little just stuck in it. That's too long. That's what I'm looking for. She's in. Grease retaining ring, again taps in until it hits a lip that's cast into the centre of the hub. Like so. That bearing spacer doesn't look all the way into me. Looks a little bit proud. That's better. Now it's all the way in. That's a lot better. Okay, next to pack the second bearing with grease. And again, put more grease inside. So it's basically lathered. That's good. And now we'll drift that in so it's snug inside the hub, and also overlaps the spacer. Don't really want to do it like this. That drift is splayed. Right, I'm just going to dress the drift because I think we'll need to use it properly, and I'll bring you back. Okay, just dressed it a little, but realised that I still couldn't use it all the way through, but with a bit of persuasion it does seem to be going. Yep. There she goes. Okay. She's tight. Oh, okay. No, she's fine. Feels nice. Let's bring you across a little bit. Oh. That's better. Nice and firm, but turns nicely. New bearings, so quite tight, but that's good. Now then, if I remember rightly, this is definitely left-hand thread. Has to be. And in fact, that's right, because you will be able to see this, but the hub is stamped LH just here for left-hand thread. And hey presto, screws in by hand. That's fantastic. And that's at the end of its thread too. That's beautiful. Well, I'm pleased with that. So after a bit of jiggery pokery on the other side and a bit of fairly hefty drifting on this side, that went in like a piece of cake. And just to tighten up, the way that I do this with the slots in this ring actually drive the speedo drive, which I'm sure you're aware. Here it is. There are two nubs in the middle of the speedo drive, so the speedo drive sits on like so. Which is good. But those slots can also be used to put, I'll easily put a chisel, which is a nice flat face, across it to tighten it up. Here we are, that's the one. It's left hand. And of course, as the wheel rotates, it will actually tighten up in any event, so it can't come undone. And that's why it's left hand thread. And that's it, wheel together. Now, I'm not quite sure if I've got all the parts and spacers to put the wheel in, but I think I have. So, give me a few minutes and I'm going to transfer the wheel onto the floor, get all the parts together. We've got the spindle, we've got the speedo drive, we've got the spacer for the speedo drive side, and I believe there's just this thrush washer that goes on the inside of the other side. This is the washer that came with the spindle and the nut, and as you can see, it's shouldered, and that shoulder sits in the swinging arm, so that goes onto the inside of the swinging arm, and obviously the nut and a separate washer go on the outside. So I think that's the sequence, but then obviously you've got the rear chain adjusters that sit there as well. So first things first is we need to just put a couple of light coats of paint on the speedo drive. I wish I'd have done that earlier actually, I thought about it, but never mind. And then we'll see if we can get the wheel sitting in with all the paraphernalia, and that will make the bike look a lot different then. So back shortly. Okay everyone, we're back at the bike, and I've just got everything prepared then to mount the wheel. So just to spin you down onto the floor, you can see we've got components left to right there for the spindle. We've got the spindle itself with a washer and a lock nut. We've got the left and right hand chain adjusters, and then on the wheel itself I'm just about to mount up the speedo drive and the speedo spacer drive, speedo drive spacer I should say, in the wheel. Which go on the right hand side. The speedo drive I have just cleaned up a little. I don't think you can see this actually. There we go. Sort of. But basically, this spacer goes inside the speedo drive against the bearing, so that the speedo drive itself doesn't get crushed. Against its own drive. Okay, let's see if that works. Just adjusting the brake plate so that the brake torque arm still doesn't get in the way, and the brake lever arm is in roughly the right position. The speedo drive to me looks as though it's sorry, you can't see too well there, I know. The speedo drive to me looks as though it's protruding too far. But I know that the the speedo drive ring is screwed all the way home, so I think it's just a case of seating this properly. Let's have a look at that. That's it. Okay, we've got it. Sorry you can't see this very well. I'm just been reseating the speedo drive properly so that it was located. So we've now got that. So I'll now move the wheel gingerly forward. Because at the appropriate point we've got to lift it up. But that's okay. Yep, we look okay. Width-wise. So, from the left-hand side, which you can't see, sorry about that, we're going to begin to insert the spindle. So, we're beginning to get the spindle in from the left-hand side. I'll just need a mallet. Rubber mallet to help with that. Actually, I've just realised I've got the chain adjuster incorrectly on this side, so we'll just start again. What I'm doing here is I have to lift the wheel up into position so I can get the spindle through the swinging arm, but the wheel is actually resting on my foot and I can raise and lower the height with my foot. It's not too heavy. That's my technique. Alright, let's see if we can do this properly this time. Right, that's the chain adjuster, either side of the arm. We're now going through the brake plate with the spindle. I'm just tapping the spindle through. You can see we're beginning to get it into position. It's snug on this side, and all we've got to do on that side when the spindle eventually comes through is put the chain adjuster on the back of the swinging arm, so we can continue to drift the spindle through. Goes. We're nearly there. Okay, I can just see the spindle coming through the speedo drive. So now I'll put the rear chain adjuster into position. I might just need it through a little tiny bit more so I can hook the rear chain adjuster onto the spindle. Like that. There. I've got it a bit too far. Possibly here. see what I've done. There. We've got it just about, I think. Yeah, there we are. Rear chain adjuster is now hooked onto the spindle, so I should be able to the rest of the spindle all the rest of the way through. There it is. She's in. That's a bit unfortunate. Damn it. There we go. Okay, so the rear wheel is in, turns nicely. Just got to be careful on this side, the brake plate's not anchored yet. That's one of the next jobs. Because we've got the rear brake torque arm to put on, which I'll do in a second. But the first thing is, these are small plates that go on the end of the swinging arm that we can insert now for the chain adjuster to screw onto. So if you like, they're the bolt abutments and they pop on the end of the swinging arm and just press on. Just make sure I'm getting them on the right way round. Looks to me as though the speedo has actually just slightly popped off. It's dry, possibly. Might be alright. We'll soon find out. There we go. I'm going to screw in the adjusting bolt just to keep that plate in place. Like that. I'm doing the same on the other side now, on this side, which you can't see. Nut washer on the other side. this up. I think the nut yet 15, 16. And when we do that, wheels nice and secure. No playing the bearings. A little tight, but I think that's the brake plate on this side. Brake action is okay. Right, let's just see if we can grab the rear brake torque arm. There it is. So we can get the position right of the brake plate, and then we can do a bit of adjusting. Okay, I'm just adjusting the brake plate on this side now to get the torque arm in the right position. Which is there. And we'll just secure the torque arm at the far end onto the swinging arm. Just loosely for now. Here we go. Nice one. Okay, there she is. Rear wheel in, seems to be working fine. As you can see, rear brake torque arm on this side as well, loosely bolted up. Rear brake arm is on, rear brake does work. That's from this side, which is the side that you couldn't really see very well. And then go to the other side. You can see we've got the speedo drive mounted in between the hub in the swinging arm, with the chain adjuster on each side as well, and it's and a small plate that the adjusting nuts butt up to. Quite why they are like that, I don't know, because the swinging arm's steel anyway. But obviously they're small plates that can be replaced if they do wear or for some reason get distorted. So that's about it. What we obviously have to nip everything up on this on each side now. The wheel is nipped up. It does rotate well. There's a bit more weight on this end now. It's a little stiff, but then it's quite flush within the rear brake plate, so it just needs a bit of running in. It's also got new bearings, but anyway, quite pleased with that. And now with all the paraphernalia on the back wheel, it doesn't look too small after all. And the rear end will change significantly once we complete it with the lights, obviously indicators, rear light, and also the rear number plate and its associated brackets. And that'll be the subject probably of the next video, because here on the bench, all ready to go, is, as you can see, a rear light unit. This is probably off a B25, or it could be a Fury, but I very much doubt it because it's used. Because these have got the short stems on, and what the bigger machines have, such as the Rocket 3 and the Lightnings, the twins, the big twins, is they have the longer 4-inch stems on, and that's correct, as they do have separate part numbers. So you can see there the difference in length. And interestingly, in the parts book, the short and long stemmed indicators as one unit are the same part number, but each of the component parts are broken down separately, and the stems do have different part numbers, so you can identify from the parts book which of these machines had long stem and short stem for the rear indicators. And in fact, we've got a good example over at the back there with the Show Fury, because it's got its original indicators and their short stems, and that's why we put short stems on the Fury SS I'm building up, and at the back of the green Bandit here are short stemmers, whereas on the Rocket 3 they're long stemmers. So this is what the Lightning will end up looking like as well, so quite a bit different from what it is now, but nevertheless, let's just straighten the bars up, because at the moment we've still got some adjusting to do up the front, and I will secure those bars now so we don't accidentally dent the tank. And that's because now we've got some weight in the rear end and no engine, the bike is a lot lighter at the front. It's still sat on its front wheel, but it's much lighter, so if you do tap the bike, the bars tend to twist. But anyway, there we are, coming on. So thanks very much for watching, everybody. You've already got a taster for what's coming in the next episode, and hopefully that will occur again in a couple of days over the coming weekend, as it's a Friday night now. So yeah, pleased with that. Job well done. Progress. Thanks all. Cheers. Bye.